Hi everyone, welcome to another session of the Birthday Salon. Today we're very privileged to have with us Theo. And Theo will be sharing with us a bit more about his article entitled The Possibilities of Kindness. It's going to be a very exciting conversation, and I would just like to pass the time right now to Hazira first, who will get the first question going, and then we'll have a discussion. Hazira, please go ahead.
Hi both.
Okay. Hello. So the first question is kind of very straightforward, and the context of this is that a lot of the conversations that we've had with other people in the Birthday Salon are about that the articles that they write are kind of like about their work or their life decisions. So what motivated you to write the article, and what was it inspired by?
Sure. Thanks both for inviting me here for this conversation. I'm very excited to be here as well. The article, The Possibilities of Kindness, appeared in the 2017 birthday book. And I wrote this at a time where I was based in the UK, and I was completing my master's program, which was in refugee and forced migration studies. At the time, I was writing my thesis, which covered some of the history of Southeast Asia's experience with refugee movements and forced migration movements in the region. And a sense of that history, especially the sense of where Singapore sat in that history, was weighing quite heavily on my mind as I put this article together. At the same time, of course, I was writing this in the UK. I did my master's in the UK in the year of Trump and Brexit. So right off the back of the Brexit referendum, as well as Trump's election victory, it seemed at the time, and I think the years since then have borne out this prediction, that the world has indeed become a more closed place, especially when both the US and the UK, countries which historically took a role of moral leadership towards a position of openness in the international sphere, began to close up in their own actions towards migrants and refugees. So it was a difficult time, especially as I was working with some migrant and refugee communities locally where I was at university at the time. And I think the way I crafted this piece was intended to make us think a little bit about what our decisions to say no, what our decisions to close our doors, what kind of effect that has on us. We often think about the impact, and rightly I should add, we often think first about the impact of these decisions, what we might call exclusionary decisions or decisions that keep others out. We think first about the impact of exclusionary decisions on the lives of migrants and refugees. They are the ones who are hurt most by such decisions. Whole lives might be held in the balance or changed by the decision of another country. But I wonder also, if we think a little bit deeper about the psyche of the country that says no, what does the act of saying no to others do to us as a country? And I think this is not a question that is often asked, certainly not a question that was asked very much in the run-up to Trump and Brexit. But I think after Trump and Brexit, when both countries' governments started saying no in a big way, it did lead many citizens and communities to consider what is happening to our country now that we have taken a closed position towards the world. And here in Singapore as well, where we do have history of having turned away refugee movements in the past, and we're not a signatory of the Refugee Convention, so we don't officially recognize refugees. Most Singaporeans don't really think about this on a daily basis. But how has this decision changed the Singapore community and also the way we tell a story of ourselves? Years from now, our children, grandchildren will look back, and how will they process the history of their country that has said no? And I think these are all interesting questions to throw up and to ask, and what I wanted to get at in this piece. I think on a more personal level, I think that's what Hazira was trying to get at with this question. Speaking as an international student based in the UK at this time, while I was a very privileged migrant, or my position as a migrant was a very privileged one, I wasn't in danger of being kicked out of the country at any point. Yet my temporariness in the UK did provide some basis for me for thinking about some of this, and also the communities I worked with also informed my views. But at the same time, I was also thinking as someone who was about to come back to Singapore to hopefully then get involved in community work here in Singapore. And the idea of coming back to Singapore, thinking about the kind of society I was coming back to and the kind of society I wanted to shape it to be, these were all on my mind as I wrote this piece. Yeah. So hopefully that wasn't too rambly an answer, but provides a jumping off point for our conversation.
Oh, definitely, yeah. Just curious, Hazira, you have any follow-up questions to that?
okay, wait, I'm still trying to process. I think at this
Sure.
point, no, but you can go
Okay.
first. And I'll
Sure,
see.
sure.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Theo, for that very wonderful coverage and contextualization of your article. I'm just curious, diving deep into some of the points that you mentioned in your article. You made a point that all acts of kindness come at a cost. And I'm just curious how you came about with that understanding that all kindness to you comes at a cost.
Yeah, I can answer this on several levels. Many of my views on these issues are also informed by my faith. As a Christian, one of the key tenets of my faith is the idea of sacrifice being a core element of love and mercy. And the fact that love and mercy has been shown towards us, we believe, did not come freely. It came with a cost. The cost being one that is very heavy in the Christian narrative. But also, I think on a personal level, thinking about kindness, we often think about charity in Singapore as something that is over and above, right? I think many of the school narratives that we hear growing up, what it means to do good is, after you have established yourself in your career, after you have earned enough to provide for your family, after you're in a good place, and then you have more, that's when you start to think about giving back or giving to others. Charity is framed to us as something that comes as an extra after everything else. It's not that this is wrong. I think this is a good perspective, and it's certainly what motivates many philanthropists after they have established themselves and amassed a huge fortune to start giving back to society. But I think also it might be that charity framed in this way comes across a little bit like an afterthought. And if we think a little bit deeper about what it means to show kindness or to show charity from square one, and it often means to show kindness and charity towards others at a point where we might not necessarily be secure, rich, or well-to-do ourselves. And it often means some sacrifices on our part. It might mean sharing what we have when we do not have much. It might mean giving up some of what we would normally see as our entitlements as members of this society. It might mean, if you draw the question bigger in our fiscal discussions about inequality in Singapore, it might mean greater taxation for the sake of greater redistribution. But whatever that looks like, right? The point is that for most people, not for our philanthropists, not for our Temasek foundations, for the average citizen, kindness, if we show it actively in our lives and our communities, will come at a cost to what people have today. And I think in Singapore, we are very used to drawing cost-benefit analyses for many things. We are very used to weighing up things in a quote-unquote pragmatic way. And in fact, we pride ourselves that this is one of our characteristics as a nation. We are pragmatic in our decision makings, especially in our policy decisions. But what this often leads us to then believe is that if the costs outweigh the perceivable benefits, right? If the costs seem to be great or too great within our current calculus, then the thing is not worth doing. But the point, if we take a step back from that, should be that there are some costs that are worth taking because of the value of what we're doing. It is not that we need to wait for the day when taking in refugees, for example, might be outweighed by the economic benefits of including refugees in our workforce, for instance. Or it might not be that taking in refugees is only beneficial at the point where we can be very, very sure that each and every last one of them will contribute positively to our community and our nation. We might not have those certainties now or ever. But the point is that even without the certainty of those benefits, and with ourselves being confronted by the costs, the action might still be worth it. And then the question becomes not when do we wait for the benefits to outweigh the costs, but how do we plan for these costs to be borne in the most equitable and most, I suppose, kind way as possible. Yeah. So that's the kind of reframing of the conversation that I wanted to make in this piece, to take us away from thinking about the cost-benefit analysis of each decision, to think about how, if we reframe the narrative, why some costly acts of kindness are good to do, both for us and for others. It's not about running away from the costs. It is then about rationalizing, bearing, and distributing those costs. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Theo. I think the different perspective and the layered answer that and the response that you gave was very, very insightful. And I think for me, one of the greatest takeaways I had when you were sharing that is the perspective, right? The perspective shifts from the self towards the other, meaning the priority is not so much what do I right now have and can give, but what does this person need? And I think that's a very important and fundamental shift in mindset and in perspective that is very helpful. On that note, though, I'm just wondering to push it a bit further as well. In your article, you also mentioned about things that Singapore has potentially forgotten and how we can potentially mitigate this forgetfulness. I'm just wondering, from your perspective right now, what are some of the things that you reckon Singapore has forgotten?
Okay, perhaps to give a little bit of background to our viewers, the theme of the 2017 birthday book was What Must We Never Forget?
Yeah.
Okay.
And so this article, The Possibilities of Kindness, was framed as an answer to that question. The point I wanted to make was that we should never forget the possibilities of kindness. Rather, we should not always think of kindness as a cost, but also as something that is a possibility, a positive act that we can take. I think if we think about your question as a collective, as a society, we often have the idea of a shared community narrative or a national narrative. And as a history student, I studied history at university before doing this master's program. One of my favorite texts was The Invention of Tradition by Eric Holdsworm, who is a British historian. And in this text, The Invention of Tradition, Eric Holdsworm points out that many of our national narratives are retroactively constructed to reinforce more contemporary necessities or more contemporary goals, agendas. I think in any community's narrative, when we think about the areas that we stress or the areas that we choose to remember and the areas that we choose to forget, often we think about this in view of what the person who is getting us to remember or forget wants us to take away from this narrative, right? So if we think about the historical narrative of Singapore, as most of us learn it in our secondary school and history textbooks, actually we think about our early leaders, post-independence leaders, as ones who were willing to take hard decisions and swallow hard truths, as it were, in pursuit of progress, equality, and fairness for our nation, right? And these are the words, some of which wind up in our pledge as well. For the sake of these good goals, they were willing to do what was then thought of as impossible. And these words find themselves in our National Day songs. People thought we wouldn't make it, but we did. So we have this narrative of triumphing against the odds that has been quite deliberately constructed through textbooks, through our songs, through documentaries, through stories about our country. And in many ways, this narrative has been fairly successful because it gels with the narrative that most individual Singaporeans think about when they think about their own lives growing up in the 60s, 70s, 80s, right? Many families who did experience a great increase in living standards during this time think about the fact that their parents or their grandparents worked very hard and were able to prosper against the odds. Yeah. So the story of individual progress and success gels with the story of the national progress and success led by individuals who were willing to go over and above and to surmount the obstacles that stood in their way. Now, somehow, when we think about all of this, right, the question of whether we took in refugees or say no to refugees was framed very differently. At the time, in some of the quotes that I include in the article, especially a quote by Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, who said that in his decision to turn away refugees, he felt like he was putting his heart through the meat grinder. The decision to say no to refugees at the time, this was in the 70s during the displacement of refugees from Vietnam. And the decision to say no to refugees was framed as one of these hard decisions that our leaders had to make in the early days of our country. It was very difficult, the narrative goes, to turn these people away. In fact, it felt like his heart was being torn apart, right? Yeah. But he had to do it for the sake of the nation. And this is the narrative that we have. But if we think about this a little bit more, it would seem actually that at the time, saying no to refugees, as opposed to saying yes to refugees, was the easier thing to do. It was easier because at the same time, the same leaders talked about the great costs and dangers that saying yes to taking in refugees would bring to the country. They were afraid that refugees from Vietnam might represent an extension of the communist threat. This was a view that Rajaratnam held and also stated publicly both in Singapore and abroad. They were also worried that Singapore, as a country with few resources, would be able to support an influx of people at this point in time. And this is still the same narrative that we hear today when we wonder, or when the conversation comes up of why Singapore doesn't take in refugees. The answer is usually we have little space and few resources, and we would not be able to take them in. So it seems, given these challenges, that saying no at the time was actually the easy answer compared to saying yes, which would have entailed them to work with these security and resource challenges, right? But that easy answer of saying no was framed rhetorically by our leaders as the difficult, hard grinding thing to do, right? And Lee Kuan Yew also said separately that, you know, you have to grow calluses on your heart, otherwise you will bleed to death. And he was framing himself as someone who was able to make a very difficult, correct decision when it would, instead of the easy decision of saying yes. So one of the points of this essay as well is to reconsider how some of the decisions, which were actually taken with fairly clear cost-benefit analysis in mind, were reframed from what was theoretically the easier thing to do or the more straightforward thing to do to something that was actually the difficult decision to make. And so today, looking back, as we remember this decision, do we remember it as our leaders tried to frame it at the time as a difficult, heart-numbing decision that they had to make? Or do we look back and realize that, hey, actually, in the question of refugees, as opposed to all the other questions that faced Singapore in its early years, instead of doing the difficult thing and surmounting the odds and going against what everyone told them was impossible, they did actually take the easy answer of saying no. And then the question is why? Why did Singapore, early Singapore, why were we able to say yes to restructuring the economy, yes to procuring land and rebuilding our housing estates, yes to very painfully restructuring our education landscape, closing one university, merging them, etc. Yes to many other difficult decisions, but no to this one. And then reframed in that way, we realized that, of course, the fact that these were refugees, these were not considered as our people, came into the consideration. And of course, there are plenty of other reasons as well why eventually in the 1970s, throughout the 1970s and also into the 1980s, we continued saying no. So this is a bit of a roundabout answer to your question. In response, let me try to sum that up. The question of what we remember or what we forget is often more a question of what we choose to remember and how we choose to remember it. And in this case, the choice of narrative that has been presented to us is the narrative of a difficult decision that has been made. But we should remember that in reality, many other difficult decisions were made. But in this case, we did take an easy way out. And in future, when we are confronted with the same question again, whether it's the Rohingya or another refugee group, or it might not even be a refugee issue, it might be another humanitarian crisis in the region, will we again take the easy way out of saying, well, our people's needs come first, this is simply too expensive, too costly, too difficult, etc.? Or will we be willing to take the difficult decisions, as our leaders did in the early days with so many other things, to say, yes, we have come far as a country, it is time to extend something to others. Yeah.
Just to add, I think Chris and I were talking about this, right, about the reframing process and the alternate possibilities. This isn't a question, again, this is an observation. Because Chris and I both are also historians, and I think we was talking about how, or at least I brought up the point where in the article, when you talked about the possibilities of kindness with regards to the refugees, right? I think one way it seemed they could be incorporated into society would have been to incorporate them in the same way that we do with our migrant workers, because like they do come with, you know, they do come with certain skills and like certain qualifications among other things. I mean, thinking very pragmatically, but then we also were just like, oh, but we also have quite a bit of hindsight, I think, when we look at this particular situation, at least when we think about this particular possibility.
So I think just responding to that, and also because outside of this piece, I've also written separately about what paths of possibility there are for Singapore to take in refugees. I think the question is often framed to us as a yes or no answer, take or don't take, right? And when we think about a question in such stark terms, and this is not just something that happens in Singapore, right? For example, in the UK during the Brexit referendum, one of the questions was open immigration or not open immigration, right? And the picture that was painted by the Leave campaign was that open immigration would mean, and the words used then were truly atrocious, words like swarms or hordes of migrants arriving, right? And it was a stark choice that was presented to the people, take or don't take, open or close. And I think often in Singapore, we tend to think along the same very stark lines as well, take or don't take, open or close, whether it's migrants, refugees, etc., etc. I think it's important for us to remember that no country is fully open. Even the countries that we celebrate as examples of openness are not fully open, right? No countries are fully open. At the same time, they did not then default to being fully closed, right? If we think about something that happened in the UK before Brexit, the UK passed this amendment or this law called the Dubs Amendment. And the Dubs Amendment was a law that obliged the UK to take in a fixed number of unaccompanied child refugees from Syria. And if you think about the way that this fits into the discourse, right? If you think that refugees arriving in the country might pose a threat, right? Because one of the common themes that is brought up is that, well, some refugees might have some beliefs that don't gel very well with our society, and they might, or some refugees might be radicalized. This is something that is repeated quite often in common discourse. Well, unaccompanied child refugees below the age of 5 are quite unlikely to be radicalized, right? If you think about how refugees might steal jobs, this is another narrative that is commonly brought up, right? Well, unaccompanied child refugees below the age of 5 are unlikely to steal anyone's jobs. In fact, with a falling population, they are more likely to fill the empty seats in our classrooms, right? So where we first start with the starting point of possibility, we can then come up with solutions that may fit our constraints, but are also not a default no or default yes. But if we start by saying it's a no or yes, and a yes means our country going to ruin, that is a false choice that our people and our policymakers are given. We should not fall back on easy yeses and nos. We should look at what are the possibilities that reside therein. And whatever the possibilities look like, whether it looks like setting a limit on the number, setting criteria for acceptance, creating a jobs program, creating jobs, full stop. In any of these areas, there are things that can be done to mitigate risk and to meet our solutions. But we have to start from a point of possibility rather than a point of saying, this is yes or no, take or don't take.
Thank you so much for that, Theo. I do have a follow-up for that, actually. I really like this idea of framing it as possibilities rather than false choices. I'm just wondering to what extent are these frames of possibilities also very time-bound, that there is a certain kind of luxury of time to be able to unpack and to discuss and to, think of solutions, and perhaps, sometimes defaulting to the yes, no's are the easy way only because there is no time. I'm just wondering how you might respond to that bit about time.
Okay, so economists like to tell us, right, in the long run, they're all dead. And that's from Keynes. Well, my professor at the Refugee Studies program, Prof. Matthew Gibney, used to have a quip that turned this quote on its head. And he would used to tell us, well, in the short run, they'll be dead. And this is indeed the truth when it comes to lots of humanitarian situations, right? Where you don't actually have the luxury of time. In a crisis, in the short run, people die. And over again, because countries say no, refugees are left in limbo in refugee camps or facing the persecution that they are unable to escape from and face the effects of that. So when we think about the urgency of our decisions, it's good to think about them against the backdrop of the urgency of humanitarian situations, full stop, right? Of course, it is not to say that humanitarian situations elsewhere outweigh any considerations at home. It's true, there are valid considerations at home that might also create a different frame of time pressure or frame of urgency.
Right.
So you are right that often in terms of domestic decision making, we do not in fact have the luxury to imagine solutions. We do not in fact have the luxury to deliberate on who we should take, who we shouldn't take, how that will look like, what will this look like 20 years down the road when our unaccompanied child refugees are all adults. We don't often have the luxury of that, right? But if we think about policy decisions more generally, we realize that, well, actually, most policy decisions are made with that kind of time pressure, right? When we think about a policy decision like increasing our TFR, right, increasing our total fertility rate, we don't know what this will look like in 20, 30 years down the road, right? When we make a policy decision like taking in a certain number of migrant workers, for instance, we don't know how this will look X number of years down the road. And yet, we allow ourselves the time and the bandwidth to think and plan ahead for these things. My point is, we should not wait for a humanitarian crisis to arrive and for the question to confront us, for us to develop what it might look like to then take in refugees. We should not wait for the worst to happen for us to have a crisis response. I think we are learning that very much now, especially in the last few months. But the same applies to humanitarian situations as well. Do we have a plan? Are we able, when the time comes, to say, okay, well, our labor market already takes in X number of work permit holders a year. Perhaps we can devote a certain percentage of this X number to those who are fleeing persecution or disaster elsewhere. If we plan this in advance, it doesn't actually make a huge difference to our calculations because the total numbers might well be the same, right? And it's just a question of the how that is thought out beforehand. So yes, time pressure, you're right, does put us in a box sometimes against our will, against our wishes. But two responses to that. The first is that time pressure is always worse for someone else when they're dying. And second, that actually knowing that this will be the case, knowing that we will have a time pressure to act in the situation of a crisis, we can plan ahead for it.
Yeah, thank you for that.
Thank you.
Yeah, I have other follow-ups, but Hazira, please go ahead.
I have a question kind of like related to this and also to the previous response, right? About how do we then have the starting point of possibilities be more accessible to people? Because I think something that's been raised, right, is that, oh, actually all these decisions can be made very, very easily because we have made similar decisions with different groups of people. So then the question becomes, right, how do we, I guess, like stop thinking and talking about refugees in a way that is detached from us? Because I think this is something that I've personally like picked up on. And frankly, like I wasn't introduced to the seriousness of refugees, of the refugee situation until like quite late in my schooling, because it was just not something that I think was mentioned in a lot of schools, or at least like, you know, with the social studies syllabus, I think the way I learned it in school was that it was something that happened in other countries for like to other people. So then the question becomes, so how do we get this conversation happening in a way that can get people to start thinking about this as something that we can do something about?
Yes, okay, so I think a few answers to that. The first is that this goes beyond schools. This is a question of our national conversation. And I think this hasn't entirely been without fruit. I think in recent years, especially off the back of the Rohingya crisis, there has been a little bit more awareness in the public sphere in Singapore. So much so that there have been public statements being made by the government as well as in community. There have also been various points of discussion, points of debate about whether Singapore should extend a helping hand to the Rohingya refugees. I think especially between the years 2015 and 2017, many of these conversations were started, some of them by community groups. We have groups in Singapore like Advocates for Refugees, Relief.sg, RLA Foundation, etc., etc. We have also many academics based at Singapore universities who study refugee issues and who speak and write often about them. But also we have MPs like Louis Ng who did raise the refugee issue in Parliament and did get a response. So I think we are not entirely without our public conversation. And during those years, especially 2015, 2017, we did see some growth in the public conversation around specifically the question of refugees. Now, the question is how to make it stick, right? And I think for this, if we widen our view to how our students in schools today, because coming back to your question, which was pitched very much from a how might we grow our students' awareness about these issues in the world angle. Well, how do we grow our students' awareness of other things? I mean, most students will not feel first the impact of environmental degradation, right?
Yeah.
But in between the year, I think roughly 2005 to 2015, actually there was a huge change in this in our schools. There were recycling clubs, there were environmentalist clubs, there was the youth environmental circle, there were all these other initiatives that were started, and the torch is now carried today by groups like Lepak in SG or Climate Rally Singapore, right?
Yeah.
From a ground-up perspective, these movements were instrumental in putting that cause, the environmental cause, on the agenda. And when I went to school, my GP essays, some of my GP essays were about environmental issues and about Singapore's obligation on environmental issues. I do think also in the same way that as themes and issues filter into public discourse and then filter from there into our education system, that they do arrive, albeit somewhat belated in some cases, but they do arrive. And that's important because we want to prepare our students for the world, right? We want to prepare our students to deal with these issues in compassionate, wise, and thoughtful ways. We want to train students who ultimately, if we disagree with them and they become really annoying young adults, we want them to at least be able to think things through for themselves. And so I did actually find, when I arrived back in Singapore in 2017, 2018, when I looked at some of my juniors' GP syllabi, that there were refugee-related questions on them. And I was grateful for this. It took a few years, it took a few decades, but we got there in the end. But there can be more concerted efforts. And for this, we can look at what some migrant advocacy groups are doing. Well, TWC too has gone into schools to do talks and workshops. So has Home. New movements that have started, like Welcome in My Backyard, have also actively been seeking opportunities to talk to students and raise students' awareness about the place of migrants in our society. Now, beyond students, right, what other kinds of public engagement are there? I think, well, the default answer these days is social media, and yes, for everything there is a social media campaign. But I think beyond that, we do have parliamentarians who are willing to raise these issues in Parliament today, right? In the last Parliament, besides MP Lewis, we had NMP Anthea and MP Walter, and many others who are willing to raise issues relating to migrant workers, to essential workers. And this we saw the most startlingly in the initial debates when the COVID crisis broke out, right? And MP Walter raised the question of what we can do for our essential workers. And if we broaden the discourse from there, right? If we raise people's awareness of what our parliamentary discourse looks like in general, if we bring thoughtful viewpoints to our mainstream media, if we engage the social media machine in thoughtful ways, some influencers have started doing this as well, lending their name and their platform to social causes. I think there are ways to continue shaping public discourse productively and also empathetically. Of course, it's a two-edged sword, right? If anything, over the last few days, we've had some interesting allegations and incidents breaking out in the social media sphere. But this is what a healthy social media sphere looks like. You will have debates, you will have disagreements, and we will have ideas being discussed in ways that are, if anything, while perhaps more noisily for some, much more thoughtfully than before.
Okay. Thank you. I think I asked the question rather hopefully. I think it was quite, I guess it was helpful to get a very hopeful response also. Yes. Yeah, I mean, yes. I want to be positive about this,
Yeah, building on this as well, and the point about social media, online sphere. Theo, you mentioned in your last paragraph, I think it should be unlike us, in other words, to forget the possibilities of kindness. That really resonated with me. And I'm wondering, to what extent can we foster this deep sense of kindness on the online sphere as well, and in social media conversations?
Well, I think the last few months have been quite instructive in this regard, right? Right off the back of the outbreak of COVID-19 in the migrant dormitories, I think we had a very hopeful moment online where we not only saw people caring, right? People who would not normally have been that aware of migrants' issues, or that not just aware, but not that bothered about migrants' issues, right? Thanks to both the mainstream and alternative media sites, were awoken, in a sense, to the situation in our dormitories. And we did concurrently have an outpouring of public support towards migrant advocacy groups and causes. We did have ground up efforts to bring the various different NGOs initiatives that were going on together.
Right.
And we did also have plenty of independent efforts, people who sold masks, donated thermometers, etc., of their own accord. And most of this, because we were under a circuit breaker, most of this did happen online. And so I think that moment was instructive in answering your question, both in a positive and negative sense. In a negative sense first, why did it take a crisis? Right? Why did it take something of this scale, infection numbers in their hundreds,
right,
the rest of the country on lockdown? Why did it take something of this scale to put the question of migrants' living conditions on the national radar? It should not have, right? And if we had the kind of public sphere that you described earlier, the kind of public sphere suffused with kindness and thoughtfulness, it should not have taken a crisis, right? And one of the reasons why it took a crisis is, of course, that first, I mean, during normal times, many of us are shielded from these things because we do live in a very comfortable society, right? But also that during normal times, I think, we may be intentionally also shielded from these things.
Right.
Right? Those who have more influence over the public sphere and the news media do not always want us to be talking about migrants' well-being and living conditions, right? There is some intentionality there as well. We shouldn't just accept that, well, this is the way the public sphere is. People don't want to talk about it, so be it, right? There are also each decision of what to cover for a journalist, what to tweet about for an influencer, and what to chase down for an MP or someone who has a public platform. Each decision comes with intentionality.
Right.
And it is no accident that during normal times, we do not think enough about these issues. So that's, in a negative sense, why did it take a crisis? It took a crisis because, and the responsibility lies on all of us, yes, but especially on those who have greater influence and greater platforms during normal times, to deliberately put these issues in the spotlight. Because the spotlight is not a third-party amorphous thing. The spotlight is something we create. But in a positive sense, right, what the last few months have shown is that it is possible. Awoken to the conditions that are out there, made aware of the situation that is going on, Singaporeans, well, not just Singaporeans, or rather by Singaporeans, I mean generally not just citizens, but those who live on this island and are able to contribute to this community. Made aware of the circumstances, Singaporeans are willing to step forward in so many different ways. From the young people who come together to shoot videos and start campaigns, to those of greater and more significant means who are able to make donations or rally their friends, to even those who we might not have agreed with, right? But even those who wrote into our forum pages to air their opinions, who might not before that have even held an opinion about migrant issues, right? Singaporeans could, for at least a month, find it in themselves to draw on their resources. And for some of them, I'm aware, made quite significant sacrifices. And here we come back to the cost of kindness.
Yes.
To respond. And so that was a hopeful moment. The cynics among us, of course, will say that this is not sustainable. Yeah, you think people normally so free to go and start campaign, give masks, sew masks. It's just because people are sitting at home with nothing to do. That's why people step forward and do all these things. Sure, so be it. The response and outpouring that came in April and May met the need and the scale of the need that was there. But during normal times, our takeaway from this should be that given a concerted effort to keep the issues in the spotlight, we might see a higher baseline level of involvement. We might see a higher baseline level of compassion and decency than we normally do in Singapore. So yeah, that's my answer to your question.
Thank you so much for that. Yeah, very, very inspired. Yeah. Well, I guess, Theo, this is not so much a question. I think it's more of a amusing, I guess, from my perspective. I grew up with a perspective or a narrative where, you know, the oxygen mask analogy on the planes where, you know, you make sure you can breathe first before you fix the oxygen mask on some other person. And I think it's so interesting how that has been challenged tremendously by our conversation, you know, that really actually I should be putting on somebody else's mask perhaps and then trying to put on my own, I think, you know. So it's not so much a question as it is, I think, not really a cognitive dissonance, but it's something that I would like to reflect a bit more about. Because I think for the longest time, and this is not overtly like spiritual or religious, but I think in certain circles, there's always this interesting creative tension between it is only in giving that you receive versus you cannot give what you do not have, right? And so for me, like here, having this conversation with you and with Hazira, I don't leave with any clear answers, obviously, but it is something that I'm still grappling with. I'm just wondering whether you have any perspective or responses to this as well. Yeah.
Yes, and I think we touched a little bit on this as well earlier when we talked about the narrative of charity that we often see in our school.
Yeah.
So two responses to this. I think first, the oxygen analogy breaks down slightly. It's not a bad analogy, but it breaks down slightly when we realize that in the plane that's going down, right, they both equally need oxygen. Both you and your kid equally need oxygen. But in the situation that we are seeing in terms of giving to our migrant community, for instance, or even opening our doors to refugees, we are already breathing. We already have oxygen. And the question is, how much of our oxygen can we give to others?
Yeah.
Right. So to reframe it slightly, it doesn't mean that oxygen is infinite and we will always be able to breathe. No. But it does mean that we are already in a slightly more secure position, a slightly more embedded position in our society than others who have been excluded or marginalized. And so the question is, well, given this gradient, right? Given this gradient between ourselves sitting here discussing this, and the many migrant workers who are still in their dorms waiting to go back to work or waiting for an answer to what might come next, right? We are already at a position of privilege, or we are already at a position where we are able to give more. So that's the first answer. The second answer is one that I think will come to challenge what I said earlier as well. And that is that if we can just for a moment replace the frame of charity and kindness with the frame of justice, what does that look like? Right? Cornel West, an activist and philosopher, has this famous line that justice is what love looks like in public. And in a sense, he draws the connection between these two things, right? That often we think of charity or kindness or love or mercy, etc., as private virtues. We think of these things as, well, so-and-so is such a charitable guy, or so-and-so is such a kind person, right? But if we think about how we want our society to look like, right, then what we actually mean when we say we want to live in a kind society is actually that we want to live in a just society.
Right.
A kind society is not just a society with lots of kind individuals. I mean, it might be, and that's great, right? No one's fighting against a society with plenty of kind individuals. But what it would actually look like, taken to its conclusion, is that we live in a just society. We live in a society where it would not take kindness for us to straighten out the gradient between us and someone else, because the society is founded on the principle that there should not be that gradient in the first place.
Right.
What a kind society looks like, if we think about writing this into our laws, our institutions, and our policies, is a just society. It's a society that's more equal, it's a society that's more fair, and it's a society where migrant workers, for instance, would not have to face the injustice of a cloud of fear every time they want to seek medical attention during normal times. So if we reframe the question slightly, if the starting point is give to ourselves first, or secure our own position first, then give to others. If we reframe that slightly, the first step is a realization that actually we already have plenty. And then how do we rebalance what we have with what others have? But then taking that 2 steps, right, beyond that, is what kind of society do we want to see? Do we want to see a society where some of these inequities are rebalanced systemically, are rebalanced structurally, and not necessarily would it mean acts of individual kindness? I mean, no society can be free of individual kindness, and thank goodness for that. Right? Individual kindness will still have a role, but what kinds of structures and institutions can we put in place to ensure that even if we were a society of miscreants, even if we were a society of scoundrels, our institutions and our policies might still save us? So I think that's the question that we want to arrive at. Now, of course, this takes a long process, right? But if we think back to both the essay and our discussion earlier,
Yeah.
it's precisely the kind of society that our pre-independence leaders, those who were fighting for Singapore to be an independent country, is precisely the kind of society that they were fighting for. It was precisely a society where some wouldn't have special access to higher positions simply because they occupied a special place in the colonial hierarchy. It was a society where all people would have an equal shot at education, at work, etc. Right? So that was the vision that we started with anyway. It shouldn't take a special inspiration or greater imagination for us to arrive at that.
Right. Thank you so much for that. Usually at this juncture, Theo, since we've had your third guest speaker in this Birthday Salon initiative, we have this special segment called Hazira's Summary. So I'd just like to pass the time to Hazira to do her magic of summarizing our conversation today.
I've also noticed how throughout this entire conversation you've been arrowing Hazira to jump in with.
Yes.
And now this is the biggest arrow of them all. So over to you, Hazira.
Yes.
Oh my God. Okay. Yeah, this conversation was a bit more challenging to summarize because I think we went a lot. Okay, like the unkind way to say it is that we went in circles a lot, but not that, right? Is that, okay, never mind, there were a lot of Swiss rolls, okay? So I think we started this conversation by asking Theo to contextualize this article a bit. Why did he write about refugees, and why are we talking about this in the context of Singapore? And I think essentially the question that he was trying to explore was that, what do we mean when we say no to refugees? And then in that, there are two parts of it. So the first part is when you say no, obviously, there's a cost-benefit analysis involved. But the question that he wants us to think about a bit more is, what does it mean when we say no? What does it say about our society when we say no? And what does it say about the considerations that we have when we when we even ask the question, and how we choose to frame that? So, and in that process, I think we also talked a bit about how in Singapore's growth narrative, there's a certain path that has been set out, and there are certain ways in which our decisions, or rather the decisions of the people who have come before us, used to justify the decisions that they have made. And specific to this, with the refugee situation, the decision to say no was framed as the more difficult decision, as the more heart-wrenching, painful decision. When actually, if you think about it in terms of the logistical considerations, among other things, it's actually the much easier decision to say no. So at the same time, we've also reframed decisions about restructuring education, about urban development. We've framed those decisions as difficult decisions that we've chosen to take. So what does it mean when we say that the refugee decision in saying no is the more difficult decision, when actually it's really not? And what does it say about us? Most Singaporeans don't really think about this. There's a certain degree of forgetfulness that comes with this, partly because it is not something that has been put into, it's not something that has appeared a lot in the conscience of Singaporeans, partly because of what we see or are exposed to in the media, and partly because of the conversations that may or may not have happened. Though now there's an increasing awareness, and that's that's quite positive. Yes. And then with regards to the conversations that we've had, I guess one of the things that we talked about is the idea of possibilities. So there was a concern that considering possibilities will necessitate having luxury of time. But as Theo pointed out, the refugees don't have the luxury of time. And this is also a problem, or rather this is a situation that is recurring. So it is not difficult for us to start thinking about this now. So at the very least, we can do something about this. That, and also a lot of the decisions that we made, a lot of the policy decisions that are made, are actually made in the same kind of time pressure. So why is this decision different or completely removed from that? And then with regards to possibilities, so how do we get the narrative of this issue into the society? And then there's been a growth of that from 2015 to 2017. But the question then is how to make it stick. And I think the point that he was trying to push forward is that someone has to consistently raise this question or context, and the responsibility falls on all of us, but it is heavier on some people who are seen more or heard more. And this is something that people should be mindful of when coming forward to think about this. And I think lastly, we talked a bit about narratives of charity, and Chris raised the oxygen masks in the plane situation. But actually what we are reminded of is that the plane situation is not a fair, it's not a fair analogy in this context because both of you need oxygen, whereas like with the refugee situation, you already have oxygen. The question is how much of your oxygen do you want to give to other people? So the idea that Theo was trying to push for was that we have to think about systemic restructuring of society, and something that he said that I think will stick with me for quite a while is that when we say we want to live in a kind society, what we actually mean is that we want to live in a just society. So the idea then is how do we change the way society is structured and maybe the way we approach things such that we are just to each other rather than kind, just kind. Yes.
Thank you so much for that, Hazira. Yes, such an amazing person for summary. I love it. Yeah. But yes, I echo that point, the last point that you mentioned, Hazira, that one thing that Theo said that will stick with me a fair bit is the reframing of kind to just. I think that was very, very remarkable. And to be faithful to time, we have reached the end of our session today. But thank you so much, Theo, for your time and your generosity and your perspectives in today's discussion. Yeah. So this is the Birthday Salon with Hazira and Theo, and we thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. Yes, and thanks everyone for tuning in.
Yeah.
Okay.
Bye.